snowstorm. My name is Lauren. I'm the marketing director here at Tarragon. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Holger Syme. Dr. Syme is an associate professor of English at the University of Toronto and the chair of the Department of English and Drama on the Mississauga campus. He holds a BA from Oxford and has received his doctorate in English from Harvard University. He's a theater historian and has published widely on the theater of Shakespeare, on the theater of Shakespeare's time, and is the author of Theater and Testimony in Shakespeare's England, A Culture of Meditation, which was published by the Cambridge University Press in 2012. More recently, he's worked on modern and contemporary performances of the classics, in quotations, particularly the English-speaking word and in Germany, English-speaking world and in Germany, and he regularly travels to European theaters and frequently writes about modern theater and performance culture on his blog, disposition.net. Am I saying it right? Perfect. So Dr. Syme will lecture for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for some questions, and we'll wrap up around 2 so you can head downstairs to see the show. Enjoy.
Thank you, Lauren. I just got back from Germany last night and came back with a terrible cold. So if I faint, so yeah, don't come any closer. I'll stay back here. And if my voice gives out or I faint or anything, don't take it too seriously. Oh God, it's happening already. So 45 minutes or thereabout is what I'm talking about. So what I want to talk about today, I mean, the title that Anne had suggested and that I sort of thought I'd run with was Germany as contemporary context. And it's a bit, I've been thinking about this. So actually, let me ask you, so none of you have seen the play yet, right?
Yeah.
So, aha, okay. So one of you has seen the play. You have, no, but behind you, right? 2, okay, good. Well, so this is a bit tricky. I'm not used to talking about plays that, partly because I largely work on classics. I'm used to talking about plays that everyone has read, and where there's no need for spoiler alerts. So, but I will try to not spoil anything for you. But the two things. I mean, we've presumably seen some of the reviews. You've seen the summary in the program, so you have presumably some idea what the play is about. And one thing I'd like to do is sort of question that, whether the reviews here all seem to have made a fairly big deal out of the fact that most of the characters in the play have some kind of connection to the former Yugoslavia. And that I think is important for the play. In some ways, it's a bit more important for the English version than for the German version of the play. But it's not actually what the play is about, I think. So I want to talk about that. I do want to, since that was sort of the brief, I do want to talk a little bit about why that topic, the question of people from the former Yugoslavia with ancestors from there now living in Germany, why that as a setting or a situation is something that's interesting in Germany right now, and what that says about German culture right now, that is a topic of interest. And then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what it means to stage a play, and a new play in Germany versus here. Because this is sort of one of those relatively rare instances where, I mean, the Tarragon is unusual in fairly regularly featuring the work of German playwrights in their seasons. Meyerhoff, Schimmelpfennig in recent years, and some of you may have seen some of those plays. But there's a fairly distinct approach here. The approach here is fairly distinct from the approach that a director or a company might take in Germany. And this is sort of one of those rare instances where not only does is a play getting performed within 2 years, both in Germany and here, but the playwright was much more involved in the process than playwrights ordinarily, or foreign playwrights ordinarily are, since Maria was a playwright in residence at the Tarragon, while the play was being adapted for here. And so I do want to talk about the differences between the two plays a bit, and the differences between the two performances. In doing that, I'm being a total fraud, since I haven't seen the German production, and nor have I seen Richard's staging yet, because I was out of the country. And if this keeps going, I will not see it this afternoon. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I want to hear the whole thing.
A model audience member. Okay. But let me start by sort of contextualizing this play a bit in the current German context. So it's true that, and I'm going to try to be very careful to not give anything significant away. But it's true that in the play, the main male character, Vlado, grew up in Croatia, although his father was Serbian, and then moved to Germany. And at a point that the play doesn't specify, what the German version tells you and the English version doesn't, is that his German is that he doesn't speak accented German, so he doesn't sound like a foreigner. If I'd had a chance to talk to either Richard or Maria before this, I would have asked why they cut that line in the English, but it's an interesting bit of information to have. But his father has remarried, and has remarried a woman with a German name, so presumably a German woman, and they are sort of, they live somewhere nearby, and have had more children since the marriage. The two main female characters are sisters, twins, I think. It's a bit unclear, but it's a bit clearer in the German than in English. I think they're twins. They're who are German, born in Germany, to parents who grew up in Germany, but have grandparents from Yugoslavia, who now would self-identify as Serbs. And all of this, so there's some of those things are more detailed in the German version than the English, and I think there are good reasons for it. I mean, partly because I think they're kind of shorthand lines in the German that would, I think, just fly by a non-German audience, and rather than explain them, you cut them. That's one of the things you do when you stage a play. Right? You decide which lines will work, and you cut the rest. So in the German, the grandfather has a line where he says, the sort of female narrator figure who's just called I, we don't know her name, she talks about the grandfather and says something along the lines of, I'd be a Serb now, he would say, sadly. So there's sort of there's some gesturing and reflecting on the conflict between the Balkan Wars, but it's relatively elusive rather than detailed. Now, one thing that remains in both versions is that Vlado, as someone who actually grew up in Yugoslavia as it was falling apart, and clearly witnessed atrocities. What those atrocities are, interestingly, is much clearer in the English version than in the German text. So witnessed atrocities and has come, but now is in Germany and sort of identifies as German. So you have this figure who comes from somewhere else, has moved to Germany, but carries a burden or a psychological baggage. Now, what's interesting about that, and what makes this, I think, a very different play than would have been written 20 years ago, say, is that that burden has nothing to do with Germany, inherently. Right? It comes from somewhere else and has been imported into a culture that is in itself that is itself traumatized still, and is obviously carrying an extremely heavy burden. But where the burden of the Nazi past is no longer the only source of trauma. So that's why I think of this as not so much a German play as a European play. It strikes me, and in fact, in the original, it's even more European than in the adaptation, since the narrator and her sister have a family biography that is largely that's largely been cut from the performance version. Again, there's nothing unusual about that. Happens all the time when plays are performed. But so in the full text, the mother of the narrator leaves their father and disappears, and it turns out she's disappeared to Sweden and has a completely new life there and a child. And so there's sort of a way. There's also a fairly significant subplot in both versions of the play that takes place in a sort of Russian enclave in this nameless German town where the play is set. So there's a kind of internationalism to the setting where people can leave Germany and go elsewhere. They can just go to Sweden, or they can just go to Croatia for a couple of days and come back and go again. And where Germany itself is inhabited by people from all over Europe, that it's actually quite hard to say exactly what Germany is or what German means, and that there's a line, sort of nameless character in the play has this one who's really only there for that line. At some point says, "Well, we're all Germans now, aren't we?" And I think so that the play, I think, reflects something about what has changed in Germany over the last couple of decades, and what identity means, the sort of role of national identity, or the sort of the dissolution of national identity for a kind of continental identity. Increasingly in the last 20 years, there's sort of an Eastern European presence in Germany that really wasn't there. When I grew up in Germany. I left in the mid-90s, but the kind of to the extent that Germany was an immigration state at all at that point, it was people from Turkey, from Portugal, from Italy, and Yugoslavia. But in that sort of, well, Yugoslavia is sort of an interesting country in that it's partly very Italian and partly very Eastern European, and it always felt like the people from Yugoslavia, of the Yugoslav background I knew growing up, might as well have been Italian, and that has shifted. I think this is true actually all over Europe, and certainly true in Britain as well. That since the fall of the Iron Curtain, and since the entry of a whole range of former Eastern Bloc countries into the European Union, and the ability to move freely within the European Union that came with that, there's a much stronger and obvious presence of people of Eastern European background in all Western European countries, and so that affects how you define a culture. It affects what you think belongs in a culture. It leads to certain conflicts, but those conflicts are actually almost not present in the play. I mean, they're hardly there. And I would think that's probably because they're not actually especially live conflicts. I mean, Germany right now is sort of undergoing a fairly tricky phase of sort of trying to sort out its identity, which has led to a whole range of public demonstrations that some of you may have heard of, especially in some of the larger Eastern German cities, that feel very xenophobic, and probably are, but they're almost entirely anti-Islam. So they sort of started. They actually started before the whole Charlie Hebdo massacre, but have continued since. They're sort of petering out right now. But there is so there is conflict. No, there's plenty of conflict in Germany, and plenty of conflict that has to do with immigration and integration and all those things. But it's actually a sort of predictable conflict about not the immediate East, but the Middle East, and cultures and religion and the religion associated with that region, trying to find a place within Germany, which has been happening for many decades. So that, whereas the presence of Eastern Europeans within Germany, I don't think carries the same kind of conflict potential. And it doesn't have the same kind of explosive charge that it feels like the sort of anti-Islamic fear it has. So I don't think that's what the play is about. I don't think conflict matters so much. What does matter in the play is a sense of strangeness, of not being quite at home where you are, but also no longer being able to return back home because that's not home either. That's certainly true for Vlado, as you'll see. It's also, however, true in a sort of interesting way for the narrator, who doesn't have any kind of actual connection to the place where her grandparents came from, except for memories of her grandparents, and the sort of memories of the not especially good German that her grandfather spoke, memories of a kind of, well, memories of something that feels to me more like a kind of general rural culture, but that the narrator seems to associate with her grandparents' Eastern European background, things like slaughtering animals at home, which I recognize is obviously not something that only happens in Eastern Europe, but in the sort of the way the play frames it, the way the narrator in the play frames it, clearly is associated in her mind with her grandparents and therefore with Yugoslavia. And there's a kind of the connection between the narrator and the character Vlado has a lot to do, and this is quite explicit, has a lot to do with the fact that he is from where her grandparents also were from. So at one point she says he smells like home. Which is obviously a bizarre thing to say, right? Because presumably Vlado smells of, I don't know, axe. Or maybe he smells of Old Spice, which her grandfather probably also used. Right? But it's an obvious fiction. It's obviously not true. But there is a kind of longing that's shared among various characters in the play for an origin. And that origin is not necessarily where you yourself come from, but sort of the place where you can trace your family to, or something like that. So when her... and this is actually... So I will keep doing this sort of comparative maneuver. This is more explicit in the German version because one whole sort of narrative strand that Maria edited out in the adaptation is the very complicated family history of I and her sister, where they have a clearly very complicated relationship with their father. They haven't spoken to him in years. He seems to have kicked the sister out. We don't know why. And the mother, like I said, has gone off to Sweden and has a whole different family there and another child. And so there is something that whereas the grandparents are sort of clearly the bedrock, the family's bedrock. So for both the narrator and her sister, all their positive references, all their sort of positive childhood memories have something to do with their grandparents. And so I think there's something going on in the play where there's a longing for family and a home, not a national home, but an actual, like a house with people in it. And that thing, for both the narrator and his sister, is their grandparents' house. And the grandparents are from Yugoslavia. So it's not an immediate, and so the topic of the play, the big theme that echoes through the play is not, I think, national, as a desire for national belonging, but a desire for familial belonging, which happens to be, to sort of have national overtones or associations in this particular setting. But I think they're more coincidental than necessary. Right? It just so happens that in the particular situation that the playwright has created in this play, someone who grew up in Yugoslavia feels like home to someone who grew up in Germany and doesn't speak a word of Serbo-Croatian. So in that sense, it really matters that in this particular play, it really matters where these people are from and what languages they speak. And that. But I don't actually think the play is trying to make a big political point. I think the play is trying to make a psychological point about a need for belonging, a need for a home, a desire for family. Now, as you'll discover, won't give a ton away, but as you'll discover, that sense of family, however, is also extremely complicated in the play. So the model of the nuclear family, where one person sleeps with one other person and then they might produce children, is not exactly what the play develops. In particular, the relationship between the character, the narrator, and the character Vlado. Now, what I haven't mentioned at all, and maybe that's wrong of me, is the thing that all the reviews say this is. Namely, well, you would have been told it's a thriller. This is actually means someone has gone missing, and this is true. This happens. Right? It happens almost 20 pages more quickly in the adaptation than in the German original. But someone goes missing. Vlado's long-term girlfriend, and the narrator, and Vlado's roommate, Clara. And exactly now, if this were a play about, I don't know, migration, or about immigrant life in Germany, which it really isn't, that plot would make no sense, because Clara, as far as anyone knows, is German. In fact, her identity seems to be so immaterial that Maria had no problem changing her name, her last name, from Zukowski in the German, which is sort of, it's Eastern European name, but it's also a completely common name in Germany now, so it doesn't actually identify you as from somewhere, to Richter in the English, which is also just a very German name. But also, actually both of those names are sometimes Jewish names, which is interesting, but I don't think meaningful. I don't think it actually means anything. But I think the fact that the playwright had no issue changing that character's name from English to German. In fact, if anything, it signals that she didn't want the character to have a name that to an English audience might read as particularly Eastern European. But Polish, I guess, Zukowski probably is. So it's clear that she has nothing to do with that in the play, and that's sort of part of the problem, is that there's a deep connection between the narrator and Vlado that has to do with their shared with their sort of shared origin, and a lack of such a sort of deep biographical connection between Vlado and his girlfriend, the missing girl, which might have something to do with the fact they don't share that connection. That's why they're just boyfriend and girlfriend. Now, but is this a thriller? I don't know. One thing, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the process of adaptation and what is different between these two plays. Because when I said earlier that the Tarragon has a very strong track record of staging recent German plays, that's true. However, I would say that what you will see this afternoon, and what you already have seen, is not actually a German play. It's a quite self-consciously. It's a text that has been quite self-consciously adapted for this theatre and for a non-German audience. In that what's much more important in this version than in the original is narrative. The way this version starts and the way it unfolds is relatively linear, and there's sort of a clear the character called I, is very clearly the narrator. Now that's true in the original as well, except what happens in the original and hardly happens in the adaptation is that the sort of narrative, the power to tell a story gets dispersed more in the original. So the other two actors who play multiple characters have more storytelling power. They interfere more with I's narrative. The lines often get split between different actors, so that there's less of a sense of narrative cohesion in the original. And the original is also much more, well, it's much less linear to the extent that, well, it's a narrative that unfolds over multiple weeks. In the English version, it starts on day 1 and it goes through to day 27, I think. And you'll see I actually have no idea how Richard has done this. I don't know if they're titles, but in the script there's sort of chapters for the second day, third day, seventh day. In the original, it's always cast as a sort of backward view. So the segments are yesterday, day before yesterday, multiple days past. So the characters themselves sort of lose a sense of time in the original because they're waiting for forever to hear news about their missing friend, and sort of as what they do every day to try and find her replicates itself, becomes more and more alike. A sense of time really dissolves. But and that doesn't happen quite the same way in the adaptation. But it's also, when any of this is happening is completely unclear in the German. Whether this has all already happened, and whether the eye actually knows the end point of the story. Which is always, whenever you have a play that is very self-consciously narrated, one of the problems is always, well, where is the narrator situated, right? Does the narrator already know where this play is going to end up? A famous example of this is Arthur Miller's A View from the Bridge, where the entire play is essentially narrated by this lawyer who begins the play as a sort of epilogue and as a prologue and has an epilogue at the end, and it keeps coming up as a narrator figure, and so it says, well, and then that happened, and then that happened. So for the entire play, you kind of know that this is already over. This has all already happened. Which is not something that's really native to the theatre. Right? One of the distinctions between theatre and narrative literature, one would think, is that the theatre unfolds in front of your eyes, and all the people you see on stage are involved in the action that is unfolding, and by the time it's over, well, so are they. Right? But whereas a narrative figure has sort of survived the story that the play shows and gets to tell it. Not so much in... what's interesting about the English version of Abyss, which in German is called Surf, yes, I mean, sort of crashing waves or something. It's a Brandung. It's what waves do when they crash on the shore. Sort of surf, right? Sort of heavy surf. So what happens in Abyss, which is kind of interesting, is that you have this very strong narrator figure, but she's telling it all in the present tense. So it's narrative, but it is happening as she's telling it. And that, I think, is formally a very interesting move. But it's very different. What she's doing, what Maria is doing in English, is very different from what she's doing in German. Although it's sort of happening because it's happening in the moment, and it's being told as it's happening. So it sort of starts there and ends there, and there aren't really big jumps. Whereas in the German original, it jumps all over the place. And in fact, now I won't give away the ending in either version, but what I will tell you is that in English you get an answer, at least a fairly clear answer what has happened. And there's a whole narrative where one of the characters reveals things that we didn't know up until that point. Events, very significant events in the last hours of the life of Carla, the girl. I guess I've just given something away. Sorry. Now, that doesn't happen in the the German at all. Like at the end of the play, you don't know. Well, you know, okay, you know she's dead, but you don't know why. You have no idea. You have no idea why she died. I mean, you have some, but there are at least three different possible scenarios, and it doesn't matter either, because color doesn't matter. What matters is what her life or her actions have sort of revealed about the people around her. Now, this is something. So, to move on to the German theatrical context, this is something that is perfectly all right in a German play and in a German production. Like the idea that you have to have a satisfying conclusion to a play is not something that most German theater artists would now necessarily agree with. I'd say of the 4 plays I've seen in Germany this week, one had a sort of a clear narrative arc, but most of them were much more interested in exploring a particular topic, or a particular argument, or a particular constellation of dramatic conflict, but without necessarily resolving it. Offering various options, leaving things open, because I think there's sort of an attitude of, well, who are we to tell you what happened? We can only show you what's sort of happening in these 2 hours. We'll give you a window on what these actors are doing, but it's not our job to tell you what really happened. It's our job to sort of put various things in motion, and you can decide which of those are important for you or interesting for you. And if none of them are interesting for you, that's okay too. You can come back next week and watch something else, and then maybe that'll work for you. But there's much more of an investment in creating images, in creating physical constellations on stage, in bringing 2 voices or people together in an interesting way and see what happens, rather than sort of rather than tell a story. So very often, and if you read interviews with actors here in England, in the United States, they will say things, when they're asked what they say their job is, they will tell you storytelling. So I'm telling a story of this character. Together we're telling this story. You will not catch a German actor say that. That's literally language that is completely alien to German theatrical culture. They might say things like, well, we were exploring something, or we were conducting an experiment. We wanted to put these 3 characters together on that stage and see what would happen. And now we're sharing with you the outcome of that experiment. We only had 8 weeks to do it, so we might not, which is 3 times as much as most of our actors get. And sometimes you have 12 weeks or 15 weeks, depending on the theater and the director. And they might not get where they thought they would get. But the idea that the job of a production is to tell the story that the play is trying to tell is really not what German theater is about. And I think that's pretty that's a generalization, but I think it's a fair generalization. Now, what's interesting to me is what happens to a German play then, when the playwright is in the room and gets to adapt it for an audience here, because obviously you can't just import one country's theatrical culture into another. It doesn't read. Right? This is not to say that you as an audience are. I don't say this to blame you as an audience. It's a question of conventions, what you're used to, what you have been watching for the last 10, 20 years, what the public discourse tells you good theater is, right? What you expect when you show up in the evening or in the afternoon. And if the theater doesn't try to meet its audience at least halfway, it's a little bit of a pointless exercise, right? So when I talk about sort of the process of adaptation, so I want to be clear that I don't think of this as a process by which the play has been simplified or dumbed down or has lost its essence or something like that, right? But it is a very different play in English than it is in German. And that's sort of interesting to me. It's something I wish I could talk about in more detail, but I can't without giving away everything. But so you just have to take my word for it. But one thing that's okay. So here's one major difference. In this process, the playwright was directly involved in doing the adapting, right? So what the large chunks that have been cut, things that have been modified, the way really the entire arc of the play is different in English. I mean, I would go so far as to say this is a different play than the German original. I mean, it's close enough that I'd sue, that if I were Maria, I'd sue the person who tried to sell the other play. But they're very different plays. But in both cases, well, in this production, the changes are largely the playwrights. Now, of course, I mean, from what I've seen from the production photos, there's obviously in this particular case. Richard Rose has obviously found a fairly striking stage language to put that play on its feet. And that you've probably seen the pictures that all three actors on stage, they hold hands for more or less the entire production. That's not in the text. In fact, the text is entirely devoid of any stage directions. Like, there's nothing in the text. It begins with the first. Well, it has a prologue. It has a brief prologue, a sort of an epigraph from a novel by Hermann Hesse, and then it just moves into the dialogue. And for the entire text, there's not a single stage direction. The only stage direction is just the end. Which means it's entirely up to the director to decide how this will live on the stage. And in a way, well, Richard has obviously gone for some very stripped down approach, which I think is interesting. What I want to briefly show you is what this looked like in its German production. Turn it on. Ah, there we go. Okay, it's warm enough. So this has had essentially one German staging that has appeared in a couple of places at some festivals, but it's a production by the Deutsche Theater in Berlin, which is one of the 5 major subsidized theaters in Berlin, and it's still running in rep there. So the way that the larger German theaters work is that they don't do productions en bloc like we do. Right? So they will rehearse for a very long time, and then they will stage a play once or twice, and then it disappears. And then it comes back maybe the next week or 2 weeks after that for a day or two. But they very rarely run the same show more than 2 nights in a row. Oh, well, because all the actors are permanent members of the ensemble. So a place like the Deutsche Theater has something like 30 actors that are permanently employed. Once they've worked there for 14 years, they have tenure. So you can't get, they may not work anymore, but they still get paid. I'm not quite sure I wish that were a joke, but it's not. Right? This is actually sort of this is sort of the fate of some older actors in Germany, that if the artistic director changes, doesn't like what they do as actors, but they're permanent members of the ensemble, so they draw a salary, but they don't get to act anymore.
It's a Senate system. It's a Senate.
It is a bit of a Senate system. But what it means is what that system means for the actors is that, I mean, any one actor will be like this here. This is the woman who plays I in the Berlin production is currently in 10 different shows. Ah, right. Yes. So. Natalia, oh god, I can't remember her last name. She plays I, the woman in the center, and she's currently in 10 different productions. And so she knows 6 weeks in advance normally what she's going to play for the next 6 weeks when. But they play Abyss maybe once or twice a month right now. So it is a very different system from ours in that sense. But this particular production of the play has been in the small. They have 3. It's in a space that is quite similar to the extra space at the Deutsche Theater. And this is. I just want to give you a sense of what the set looks like. I guess let's sit down. So one theme in the play is this river. That freezes over fairly early on in the play and doesn't and then thaws at almost the very end. And so what they did in Berlin is they have this set. So the back wall essentially of the set is sort of this angled grid of what looks like window panes, but in fact is blocks of ice. And as the play goes on, they melt. And so what is revealed back there is actually not very much, but I think it's of a sense that as the play goes on, something gets released, something is inaccessible and becomes accessible as the play goes on. Again, not something that is in any way in the text as a set design, but as a theme it is. Right? The freezing and thawing river and the sort of gradual revelation of obscure or mysterious things, although plenty of other things remain mysterious, is in the play. So the other thing that happens in the German production is that there's a fourth character who's a man dressed as a mermaid with a harp. And I have no idea why. And nor does the playwright. But now that tells you something, though. Okay, so for one thing, okay, so he hardly has any lines. He speaks the epigraph from Hesse at the beginning, and then he disappears behind the blocks of ice for a long time and makes live music from there. And this is he's actually the composer. So but then once the ice melts, he comes forward and apparently takes part in the action in some way, although he doesn't have any lines. Now, I mean, there are a couple of things to say about this. With this. I think that must be fairly close. So there are a couple of things I'm going to say about this. You might not expect it from what you'll see this afternoon and what you might have read in reviews, but by all accounts, the German staging of this play is actually quite funny. Now, I suspect our version isn't, right? No. And it's interesting talking to Maria about this, because, well, one thing she said to me is, well, you know, the director is a young guy, and most of the lead, the guy who plays Lado, is a young guy, and I think there were certain things about the play they just didn't get. And they didn't care for them, so they ignored them or downplayed them. And that's what you expect as a playwright in Germany. And that's okay. I mean, you know, there's some things. I think she doesn't love the mermaid. And there's I think, a level of well, some playwrights certainly feel that they're sort of victims of a system where they have no real voice. But by and large, I think the sort of cultural consensus in the German theatre world is that playwrights produce a text, and that's where the responsibility ends. And how that text then becomes a show is entirely a theatre's responsibility. Which means it's partly the responsibility of a dramaturg who edits the text, right, cuts it, adds things in. Partly the responsibility, largely the responsibility of a director, obviously, who has final say. But, and this is something that in sort of English language discussions of German theatre always gets underestimated. It's primarily the responsibility of the actors. And the vast majority of German directors I speak to will say some version of a statement like this. I couldn't do my job without the actors. I depend on the actors. I come into the rehearsal room with ideas, but I don't insist on any of them because the actors almost always have better ideas. So that the job of a director is editing down what the actors offer you and figuring out how what the actors want to do on stage in a particular moment can in some way be reconciled with what the text seems to want. And to make the decision whether you want to trust the actor's instincts or the playwright's. And more often than not, what happens in Germany is that the actor's instinct wins out over the playwright's. And if that doesn't happen on opening night, it will. 2 or 3 days later. And so, and I think that is broadly understood by German playwrights. Not so much by their living heirs. I don't know if any of you saw the reports that there was a production of Brecht's Baal in Munich, by all accounts a very powerful production of Brecht's Baal that Brecht's heirs objected to because it had so much text, so much of the text was cut, so much was interpolated from Rimbaud and from Carl Schmitt, who's sort of a German philosopher mostly known for the role he played during the Nazi period. So Brecht's heirs objected, and since Brecht's plays are still in copyright, this went to court, which hardly ever happens in Germany. And they just, 2 days ago, the theatre had to agree that they would only perform it once more. And then one more time in Berlin at the great German theatre festival that happens every year, where the 10 most remarkable productions of the year get invited. So this particular production, unfortunately, had been selected. So they get to play it. They get to play it one more time then, but no more. Now, what's remarkable about that particular incident is that this hardly ever happens, right? That a playwright or a playwright's heirs assert their rights, their legal right. I mean, their legal rights are as strong in Germany as here, right? Except they hardly ever get asserted. So that had happened in this case was interesting. What's more interesting is that the Brecht's heir was almost universally condemned for this in the press. Like the entire, like every single German newspaper, this was on the news everywhere. And they were all, they couldn't stop them, they couldn't stop going on about how ridiculous this is, and how old-fashioned, and who does this person think she is. Which I think is the exact opposite reaction you'd get from what you'd get in the newspapers here. In fact, it happens fairly regularly. And of course, one thing so this is the last thing I'd say, in terms of attitudes. One thing that I think is fairly common now is if you open a newspaper, if you open a newspaper review here, especially of an older play, is for the critic to say, well, this isn't really so-and-so's play, because they adapted and changed the setting, or whatever. But there's the sort of sense that you need to warn the audience that you need warning if the play is a bit different from the one you might have read when it's on stage. That would never, it would never ever happen in a German review. In fact, the only thing that would get remarked on of that nature is if someone staged a play exactly as it seems to have been envisaged on the page. That would get mentioned, and it probably would get mocked. But the idea that an audience needs warning is completely enough. I mean, you need warning if something is predictable. What you should expect when you go to a theater is the unpredictable, the surprising, the shocking, maybe the upsetting. Right? You probably should be a bit angry when you come out of a theater. I think there's that sort of ethos. But certainly not something you certainly don't. And again, I don't think either of those things is necessarily better than the other. And I like playwrights, quite large. I like talking to playwrights. I understand why playwrights get grumpy when the theater stages one of their plays and only puts half the text up, right? Changes a character and adds a mermaid. I mean, obviously a playwright has a particular idea of what this thing will be once it's on stage. But at the same time, I also think it's kind of exciting if I've read a play and I go to the theater and something happens that I couldn't possibly have predicted. And the lines don't come where I know they should come. That is also, in a way, is what makes the difference between theater and films. I can watch the same film 10 times over, and it's always going to be the same. It might feel different because I might have a terrible cold, or I might have just broken up with someone or something, and the film will have a completely different impact on me, but the film itself won't change. Whereas in the theater, and no matter where, this is true here as well, there will be moments in this afternoon's show, doubtless, where an actor will say a particular line slightly differently than he or she did yesterday. Someone's hand will slip in a way that it won't tomorrow. Right? There's that sort of way in which theatre is always different every night, that's a universal. But the total unpredictability of what a particular staging of a particular show will look like from one theatre to another, I think also sort of embraces something that's essential to theatre in German theatre culture at the expense of the predictability and the responsibility that comes with the respect that playwrights command in our theatre culture. And I think those two things are different, but not necessarily. I don't think one of them is necessarily better than the other. But this particular play has at least given me a sort of interesting opportunity to look at the same play, or what seems to be the same play, filtered through two very different processes. And I've gone on for far too long, but my voice seems to have held up more or less. Thank you. If we have a few minutes, maybe, since we started a bit later, right?
5 minutes or so.
For questions? Yes.
I cannot help but think of Weiss's Marasad. When you're talking about the German tradition and the unpredictable and how much the actors carry as they go along. Is that why he wrote it that way?
Well, I mean, it's certainly partly.
I'm only going by the script, the text.
Yeah.
I've never seen it live.
Ah.
I will in a couple of months.
Aha. Well, it doesn't. Yes. So you mean, is it written that way, like in the sort of way that it clearly needs an actor's help to... And
the actor's freedom.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's a bit tricky to say with, so when Weiss wrote that play, it was a particular political moment in German theatre. So the particular freedom of actors to sort of be in the moment and maybe say something different one night than another, that is relatively recent. That particular kind of freedom is relatively recent. The tradition of a company or a director or a company taking a play and doing something with it, it goes back a long way. And this is something that was happening right after the First World War. When Weiss wrote Marasad, what you had in Germany was sort of this movement on the part of some theatres, and in particular the Schaubühne where it was first staged, to hand over decision-making processes to the ensemble. Which was, it's a sort of 1960s moment of creating quasi-communist theatre collectives where there isn't a director, there isn't a producer, the ensemble decides about what will be, what plays they'll do. No one gets to make decisions except the collective. And I think it is
It liberated them.
Yes, that was a kind of liberation.
Okay.
That doesn't necessarily mean that the acting styles that you'll find in West German theater at that time, like if you look at old film productions, are as free or as improvisatory as many German actors work now. That's something that happened in the 1990s. But yeah, no, that play does come out of a kind of liberation moment, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Once a play is set, I assume, or is it never set? Because generally we're used to maybe, well, okay, go ahead, try it out. But then usually the director has the final say and says, yes, it's in or it's out. How does that work? Can they do something different the next night?
It depends. It depends. I mean, there's some directors who are quite rigorous in their choreography and lighting design. Right? That obviously limits what an actor can do differently any given night. If you're only in the light, you stand here. You can't dance over there. Well, you can, but you'd be in the dark, which might also be interesting. But so someone like Robert Wilson is someone who's an famous American theater maker who mainly works in Berlin now. So Wilson does extremely choreographed things where like actors' movements are like every single movement has to be right. And there's not a whole lot of room for improvisation. At the same time, I saw a show 2 nights ago that was similar in a way, and that was obviously highly choreographed and very detailed in a sort of non-naturalistic acting style. It was a production of Molière's School for Wives. At the same, and it was the text was a modern translation of Molière's play, but it was in rhymed verse, and they were speaking rhymed verse, and they were getting a ton of comedic mileage out of all those rhymes, and they made no attempt to disguise the fact that this was a play, and it's completely radically non-realist. At the same time, the actors obviously ad-libbed. And threw in things. And what I didn't realize, they even ad-libbed some of the rhymes. And the director happened to be there. So this is okay, anecdote. So for that particular production, the second largest male role, the sort of young male, the entire part from a DVD, in this sort of highly choreographed thing, met the lead, Arnolf, at 5 o'clock that day, for an hour and a half or so, and then did the entire show at 8 o'clock. And you wouldn't have been able to tell that it wasn't. And so the director was there because of that. He basically he flew in to direct that 2-hour rehearsal. And he was there afterwards. So I was chatting to him, and he said, and the thing that he said, the moment he realized that this was going to work is when the sub started ad-libbing. And he said, okay, good, so he's got it. It's his part now. He's mastered the part to the extent that he feels he has the authority to own it and do with it, within reason, whatever he wants to. So yes, there is obviously a moment. And if you talk to German actors, one thing they'll say, one phrase they'll use that I really like, that translates only very clunkily into English, is there comes a point in rehearsal when things play well together. It's spielt. Things are just playing along. And that's when you don't screw with that anymore. Once you've reached that, you try to replicate that.
That's true.
And it's a little bit like jazz, I suppose, right? There comes a point where, yes, you improvise a lot, but there's also a melodic line or a moment that you will try to hit because, it works. And so that, I think, those are the two, so that it's a continuum. There's some things that will be the same every night. But there's much more freedom in between those fixed points to do whatever feels right on the night. Now, the thing is, this is partly an effect of the repertoire system. Right? If you get to play a particular role only once every other week, he won't remember it in the same level of detail that our actors do. Right? And every German actor has these anecdotes of walking on stage having no idea what her line is. And only realizing that in that moment because, it's been 2 weeks. And then having to, yeah, that's right, which play am I in? Oh, yeah, right, it's Wilhelm Tell. And that, it creates, it's an accident that it creates a kind of freedom, but it does. One more question? Is that
one more, yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, I'm thinking of David Mamet, for example.
You die.
Well, yeah, he specifically says if you change one word, I'll kill you.
Yeah.
And are his plays performed in German?
Not very often. I wonder if Mamet doesn't like long-haul flights. But as far as I know, he's never come over to attack anyone. In general, contemporary American playwrights don't get performed a ton. Tracy Letts hardly at all, a little but hardly at all. Mamet a tiny bit, but not a lot. English playwrights get performed a lot, but then there's sort of a recent trend for some German directors to work in London, and so there's some English playwrights that seem to really appreciate sort of letting things happen in the rehearsal hall. But yeah, that kind of Tennessee Williams is an interesting example because German companies get away with doing things with Tennessee Williams that no English-speaking company would ever get away with without getting the estate on their back. I think it's partly because it's in translation, right? So how will the estate know? But like things like plays written in a particular dialect or a particular accent never get staged in that. Like I don't think I don't think I've ever seen a German production of a play where the actors speak a particular dialect. Right? If you think how important that is to our theatre aesthetic, right? Like, imagine Streetcar Named Desire just if it was set in Etobicoke. Actually, I'd like to see that. It just is not. It's not a concern, and it very, very rarely happens that a playwright insists on his or her rights to have the play staged exactly as it is on the page. When it happens, it's true actually. Practically all the incidents like that I can think of have been American playwrights or Brecht's heirs. But no, otherwise, someone like Mamet wouldn't get staged. All right, thank you all.
Yes.